The rain was relentless, drumming on the windshield of John's old pickup as he drove down the desolate highway. His eyes flicked to the fuel gauge, which hovered just above empty. It was nearing midnight, and the dim glow of his headlights barely pierced the thick fog ahead. As he rounded a bend, a neon sign appeared in the distance: Earl's Diner, open 24/7. The letters buzzed faintly, some flickering as if on the verge of going out. John's stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since noon. He pulled into the gravel lot, the tires crunching noisily, and parked near the entrance. Inside, the diner was a relic of the past: red vinyl booths, a jukebox in the corner, and a counter lined with swivel stools. The air smelled of coffee and fried food, mixed with a hint of something metallic. A woman in her late 40s, wearing a stained apron and a name tag that read Marge, stood behind the counter. Her smile was friendly but strained. "Late night, huh?" she said, pouring coffee without asking if he wanted any. "Yeah, long drive. I saw the sign and figured I'd stop." Marge nodded. "Menu simple: burgers, fries, and the best pie in the state. Take a seat wherever you like." John slid into a booth near the window, his view obscured by condensation. He wiped it with his sleeve, noticing another car in the lot, an old sedan with one headlight shattered. The diner was nearly empty, save for a man at the counter nursing a mug of coffee. He was hunched over, his leather jacket soaked from the rain. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the counter, a faint but deliberate beat. "What'll it be?" Marge asked, pen poised over a small notepad. "Burger, fries, and coffee, I guess." She nodded and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving John to glance around. The jukebox played an old tune he couldn't place, but its melancholy tone added to the eerie quiet. The man at the counter turned slightly, catching John's eye. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "First time here?" the man asked, his voice raspy. "Yeah. Just passing through," John replied, trying to keep it casual. The man gave a weak smile. "Most people are." Before John could ask what he meant, Marge returned with his food. The burger was greasy but smelled fantastic. He took a bite, savoring the flavor, and for a moment, he forgot the oddness of the place. But then he noticed the clock above the counter. It hadn't moved since he walked in. "Is that clock broken?" he asked Marge. She glanced at it, her smile tightening. "Just an old clock. Don't mind it." The man at the counter chuckled softly, but there was no humor in it. John's unease grew. "How long has this diner been here?" Marge tilted her head. "Oh, a long time. We get all kinds of folks passing through." As he ate, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man at the counter got up to leave, dropping a few bills on the counter. "Good luck," he muttered as he passed John. "Good luck with what?" John called after him, but the man didn't respond. The door swung shut, and John watched him climb into the old sedan. For a moment, the car just sat there, idling. Then it pulled out onto the highway and disappeared into the fog. When John turned back, Marge was staring at him, her expression unreadable. "You'd better finish up, hon. Storm's getting worse." John nodded and took another bite, though his appetite had waned. He paid his bill and thanked her before stepping back into the rain. As he climbed into his truck, he glanced at the diner one last time. Through the fogged-up windows, he thought he saw someone standing at his booth, staring out at him. He shook his head, dismissing it as his imagination, and pulled onto the highway. But a few miles down the road, the neon sign of Earl's Diner appeared again, flickering faintly in the distance. John's heart raced as he realized it was the same lot, the same diner, the same cars parked outside. The rain poured harder as he slowed to a stop, his mind racing. The story could be continued with John deciding whether to confront the mystery of the diner or attempting to escape its seemingly endless loop. What will he uncover if he goes back inside? The truck's engine was still running when John stared at the flickering neon sign. The fact that it was the same diner seemed absolutely unreal to him. He looked around, checking the road he had come from. The asphalt, wet from the rain, looked like an endless black ribbon that disappeared into the darkness. "Maybe I'm just tired," he muttered to himself. But the site of the diner was exactly the same as before, down to the details. The old sedan with the broken headlight was still parked in the lot. John gathered himself. Maybe it's just a similar diner. Nothing to worry about. But his hand on the steering wheel trembled slightly. Instead of going inside, he decided to see what would happen if he drove further. Turning on the high beams, John pressed the gas and continued down the road. He kept a close eye on the roadside markers, trying to find any kind of landmark. Minutes passed, maybe half an hour, before he saw something new, a gas station. The sign was dirty, and the light flickered, but this was clearly not part of the diner. John stopped and got out. The rain had slowed, but the cold wind cut through him. The gas station seemed abandoned, no movement, just empty pumps and dark windows. He decided to check the building. Inside was dark, but there were half-empty water bottles and bags of chips on the shelves. The flashlight from his phone illuminated the space. On the counter was a notebook, which immediately caught his attention. He opened it and saw several lines written in different handwriting. "If you're here, you're trapped too. There's an exit, but I couldn't find it. Don't go back to the diner." The last entry was fresh, the ink still not dry. "Don't trust the woman in the apron." John felt a chill run through his chest. He instantly remembered Marge with her nervous smile. Suddenly, there was a sound outside, like someone was approaching. John quickly turned off the flashlight and hid behind the counter, trying not to breathe. The footsteps were heavy, but not hurried. They passed by the entrance and disappeared toward the road. When John mustered the courage to peek, he saw only tracks on the wet gravel. They led toward the diner, which was now visible in the distance, its neon sign flickering again. John realized he was in danger. But what to do? The feeling that he had become part of some strange game only intensified. He decided to return to his truck and drive in the opposite direction from the diner, even if it meant veering off the road. His only goal now was to find someone who could help or get onto a familiar road. The further he drove, the denser the darkness seemed, and the radio was silent, as if the signals had simply vanished. But then he saw something in the headlights, a figure standing by the roadside, waving at him. John hesitated. In the darkness, the figure appeared barely visible. It was a woman in a hooded cloak. She stood by the roadside, energetically waving her arms, clearly asking for help. "This is the last thing I need," John thought, gripping the steering wheel. The warning in the notebook flashed through his mind, "Don't trust the woman in the apron." But this wasn't her. This was just a passerby, right? Slowing down, he rolled down the window a few inches, keeping the engine running. "Are you stranded?" he asked, trying to sound confident, though inside, he felt a cold fear. The woman took a step closer, her face illuminated by the dim headlights. She looked exhausted, panic reflected on her face. "Please, help me," she said, her voice weak, almost trembling. "My car got stuck a little further down the road. I've been trying to find someone for over an hour." John didn't respond immediately. Her story sounded plausible, but everything about the evening felt suspicious to him. "Listen," he finally said. "Maybe I should just call for help. There's a gas station nearby. I have a phone." "No. You don't understand," she interrupted, her voice now sharper, almost desperate. "This place. It's strange. When I went for help, I kept coming back to the same spot. I feel like something's wrong here." John felt his heart race. The woman was saying exactly what he had already sensed but was too afraid to admit. "Get in the truck," he said tersely, opening the cabin door for her. She climbed inside, raindrops dripping from her cloak, and she shivered from the cold. "Thank you," she murmured, fastening her seatbelt. "Where do you want me to take you?" Just away from this place, she said, nervously glancing over her shoulder. John pressed the gas pedal, and the truck rolled down the road. They drove in silence, the only sound being the rain and the hum of the engine. "What happened to your car?" he finally asked. "I stopped by that diner," she replied, lowering her gaze. "I thought I'd grab something to eat and rest. But after I went out, everything went wrong. At first, my car wouldn't start. Then I decided to walk, but every time I walked the road, I kept ending up back at that diner." John felt a chill run down his spine. "Did you go inside? Talk to Marge?" The woman sharply turned her head toward him. "How do you know her name?" His heart clenched. "I was there too," he confessed. Her eyes widened. "Do you realize that this place is a trap? You can't just leave from there." John didn't want to hear this. He pushed the gas pedal harder, but the road ahead looked the same again. He noticed what he had feared, a light in the distance. It was the same neon sign. "No," he muttered. The woman grabbed his hand. "You need to stop." "What? Why?" "I think this place is playing on our fears. The more you panic, the stronger it holds you." John slammed on the brakes, and the truck stopped in the middle of the road. He turned off the engine and tried to calm his breath. "What do we do now?" he asked. "We need to think clearly," she said, looking directly into his eyes. "If we can find a way to break this cycle, we can escape." Their thoughts were interrupted by the faint light of headlights approaching from the other side of the road. The headlights were approaching slowly, and John and the woman froze, staring into the darkness. It was another truck, old, with peeling paint and a creaky engine. The driver looked through the window, his face barely visible in the light. "Are you lost?" he asked loudly, turning off the engine. John leaned out of the cabin. "Yes. We can't figure out how to get out of here." The man nodded as if he was familiar with this feeling. "This road has always been like this," he said in a hoarse voice. "Those who stop at the diner usually get stuck here for a long time." "Are you sure you didn't eat there?" "No," John replied. "But we were inside." "Then you still have a chance," the man said, leaning on his truck's door. "You need to find the original path, the one you came on. And don't get distracted. The roads here trick you." "What is this place?" the woman asked. The man just shrugged. "A place where people end up when they turn the wrong way. If you're lucky, you'll find the exit." "And if not?" John asked. "Then you stay here," the man said, casting a glance into the darkness. "But I'll help you. Follow me." John and the woman had no choice, so they decided to trust the stranger. They followed his truck, keeping a safe distance. The road twisted, and the light from his headlights seemed like the only guide in the sea of darkness. Time stretched endlessly. The woman was silent, clutching her seatbelt, and John focused intently on the road. Finally, after a few minutes or hours, it was hard to tell, they saw a familiar sign on the side of the road. It was the sign for the highway where John had turned off. The man stopped his truck and got out, waving his hand. "From here, you're on your own," he said. "Don't stop until you see familiar sights. And remember, if something pulls you back, ignore it." John thanked him, started the engine, and pressed the gas. They drove in silence, both too afraid to even glance back. After a few miles, the darkness began to lift, and the outlines of trees and bushes on the roadside became clearer. The radio in the cabin came to life, filling the silence with a faint signal from a local station. John and the woman exchanged glances. "We made it," she whispered. John just nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. When he saw the sign for the next town, his heart finally started to calm. He stopped the truck at the first gas station, where there were bright lights and people. The woman got out, thanked him, and quickly disappeared inside. John stayed in his truck, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He never drove that road at night again. And the diner only appeared in his nightmares. Tom Harris was a seasoned trucker, used to long nights and lonely stretches of road. But even years of experience couldn't prepare him for that particular night. He was driving west through the sparsely populated plains of Idaho when his fuel gauge started dipping far too quickly for comfort. The next town was at least 50 miles away, and the dark, narrow road offered no signs of life. Just as Tom began to calculate how far he might get before running out of gas, he spotted a dimly lit neon sign ahead. It flickered erratically, reading, "Copper Mug Diner." Relieved, he pulled into the gravel parking lot. The diner sat in isolation, surrounded by nothing but open fields. The building was small and rundown, but the lights inside glowed warmly. Tom stepped out of his cab, stretched his legs, and made his way to the door. Inside, the diner was almost too normal. The checkered floor was clean, the jukebox in the corner softly played a country tune, and the smell of coffee and bacon lingered in the air. A middle-aged waitress with a name tag that read Lori approached with a tired but friendly smile. "Late night?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee before he even ordered. "You could say that," Tom replied. "Didn't think I'd find a place open out here." "We're always open," Lori said. Her smile seemed genuine, but something in her tone felt off. Tom took a seat at the counter and glanced around. There were only a few other patrons, an elderly man nursing a bowl of soup, a young couple quietly talking in a booth, and a man in a suit staring blankly at the wall. Something about the atmosphere felt heavy, like everyone was carrying a burden they didn't want to talk about. As Tom sipped his coffee, he noticed a bulletin board on the wall near the restroom. It was covered in photos, all Polaroids, showing people standing outside the diner. Some smiled broadly, others looked reluctant. But every photo had a handwritten date scrawled across the bottom. The most recent one read March 12, 2025, today's date. "Hey, Lori," Tom called, pointing to the board. "What's with the photos?" "Oh, we like to keep a record of everyone who visits," she said casually, refilling his cup. "It's tradition." "Bit unusual," Tom muttered. Lori chuckled. "Well, so's this place." Tom finished his coffee and ordered a slice of pie. As Lori disappeared into the kitchen, he noticed the man in the suit stand abruptly and leave. No one else reacted, but Tom glanced out the window and saw something strange. The man didn't head to a car. He simply walked into the darkness beyond the parking lot. A chill ran down Tom's spine. He looked back at the booth the man had occupied and noticed something odd. The man's tie was draped over the back of the seat, as if he'd shed it in a hurry. "Forget something?" Tom asked aloud, though no one answered. The elderly man at the counter cleared his throat. "You shouldn't be here too long," he muttered, not looking up from his soup. Tom frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't reply, just stood and shuffled out of the diner, leaving Tom and the couple in the booth. Lori returned with the pie, setting it down with an unusual urgency. "Anything else I can get you?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched. "No, this is fine," Tom said, though his appetite had faded. As Tom picked at the pie, he began to feel a gnawing unease. The couple in the booth was gone, he hadn't even noticed them leave. The diner now felt vast and empty, despite its small size. Lori was cleaning the counter but avoided looking at him directly. Tom stood and left a 20 on the table. "Thanks," he said. "I should get going." "You sure?" Lori asked. "It's late, and the road ahead can be unpredictable. I'll take my chances." As he stepped outside, Tom saw his truck parked where he left it, but the diner behind him felt wrong. The light seemed dimmer, the neon sign barely flickering. He climbed into the cab and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and he pulled out onto the road, not daring to look back. About 10 miles down the road, Tom spotted something that made his stomach drop. A Polaroid picture was tucked into his dashboard. It hadn't been there before. His hands shook as he pulled it free and flipped it over. It was him, standing in front of the Copper Mug Diner. The date at the bottom read March 12, 2025. Tom glanced in his rearview mirror. In the distance, the neon sign of the diner flickered one last time before disappearing into the night. Tom gripped the wheel tightly, his mind racing. He had no idea how the Polaroid got into his truck, but he wasn't about to turn back and find out. The dark road stretched endlessly before him, illuminated only by his headlights. His thoughts spiraled. Had someone slipped the photo into his truck while he was distracted? Was it Lori? The old man? And what about the man in the suit who had disappeared into the night? The radio crackled suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts. A faint voice came through, barely audible over the static. You shouldn't have left. Turn back. Tom's heart pounded. He reached for the dial and turned the radio off, but the voice persisted, growing clearer. Tom. You need to come back. His name. How did they know his name? Panic took over. Tom floored the accelerator, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the diner. He glanced at the Polaroid again, now lying on the passenger seat. In the faint light from the dashboard, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. In the background of the photo, through the diner's window, someone was staring out at him. A sharp knock on the passenger window made him slam on the brakes. Tom's truck screeched to a halt in the middle of the road. His breath caught in his throat as he looked to his right. The window was fogged up from the outside, but there was no mistaking the faint outline of a hand pressed against the glass. Before he could react, the hand slid downward and vanished. Tom sat frozen for a moment, his heart thudding in his chest. He glanced in his rearview mirror, but the road behind him was empty. Gathering his courage, he decided to keep driving, slowly this time. He reached for his phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen was dead. A mile later, his headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was the man in the suit from the diner. Tom swore under his breath and slammed on the brakes again. The man didn't move, just stood there, his face pale and expressionless. Tom rolled down the window slightly. Hey! What the hell are you doing out here? The man tilted his head, his lips moving as if he were speaking, but no sound came out. Tom's patience snapped. Get out of the way, he shouted, leaning on the horn. The man took a single step toward the truck, then another. Tom didn't wait to see what would happen next. He threw the truck into reverse, backing up quickly before turning onto a narrow dirt road to his left. The dirt road was rough, and Tom's truck rattled as it climbed a small hill. He told himself he was putting more distance between himself and whatever was happening back there. At the top of the hill, he spotted another light in the distance. It wasn't the diner, this light was smaller, dimmer, like a porch light. He pulled closer and saw a small house, its windows glowing faintly. A gas pump sat off to the side, old but functional looking. Relief washed over him. Tom parked the truck and stepped out cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. He approached the door and knocked. An elderly woman answered, her eyes sharp and curious. What brings you out here so late? I'm running low on gas, Tom said, forcing a smile. Saw your pump and thought maybe you could help. She nodded slowly. Of course. But tell me, did you come from the diner? Tom hesitated. Yeah, I did. Why? Her expression darkened. You shouldn't have stopped there. Tom frowned. What are you talking about? What's wrong with that place? The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned and beckoned him inside. You need to hear something, she said. The truth about the diner. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and herbs. The woman motioned for Tom to sit at the kitchen table while she poured 2 cups of tea. That diner has been there for decades, she began. But it doesn't belong on any map. People stumble upon it, just like you did. And once they do, it doesn't let them go so easily. Tom felt a chill run down his spine. What do you mean? She sighed. Everyone who stops there is tested. The diner shows them something: memories, fears, regrets. It lures them in and keeps them trapped unless they figure out how to break free. You're lucky you left when you did. Tom shook his head. This sounds insane. The woman leaned forward. Do you still have the Polaroid? Tom hesitated, then pulled it from his pocket and slid it across the table. The woman studied it, her face unreadable. This is your warning, she said. Don't go back. No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, keep moving forward. Tom didn't wait to hear more. He refueled his truck with the gas from her pump, thanked her, and drove off into the night. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Tom finally reached the interstate. He pulled into a rest stop, exhausted but relieved. As he stepped out of the truck, he noticed something strange. Another Polaroid was tucked under his windshield wiper. His hands shook as he picked it up. This time, it wasn't a picture of him at the diner. It showed the old woman, standing in her doorway, staring straight at the camera. And behind her, through the darkened windows of her house, was the faint outline of someone, or something, watching him leave. Tom stood frozen in the rest stop parking lot, the Polaroid clutched in his trembling hands. His first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity got the better of him. He inspected the photo closely, his pulse quickening. The old woman's expression was grim, her eyes almost pleading, as if trying to warn him. He glanced around, suddenly hyper-aware of his surroundings. The rest stop was quiet, with only a few parked cars and a faint hum from the vending machines. The sun was rising, painting the horizon in soft orange hues, but it did little to calm the unease crawling under his skin. Tom folded the photo and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know who or what was playing this game with him, but he was determined to keep moving. He got back into his truck and started the engine, deciding to head straight for the nearest city where he could find people, light, and maybe even answers. As he drove, Tom remembered his CB radio. It wasn't connected to whatever strange interference had affected his regular radio. He reached for the mic and broadcasted a message to any nearby truckers. Breaker 19, this is Bluebird. Anybody out there? There was a moment of static before a voice crackled through. Bluebird, this is Roadrunner. What's the problem, driver? Tom exhaled, relieved to hear another human voice. I just had the weirdest night of my life, Roadrunner. Ever heard of a place called the Copper Mug Diner? The line went quiet. Too quiet. You still there? Tom pressed. Finally, Roadrunner responded, his tone uneasy. Yeah, I've heard of it. Don't tell me you stopped there. I did, Tom admitted. What's the deal with that place? You're lucky you're still talking to me, Roadrunner said. That diner's bad news. I've heard stories, truckers who stopped there and were never seen again. Or ones who left but weren't the same after. What do you mean? Tom asked, gripping the wheel tightly. Memories that don't belong to them. Seeing things that shouldn't be there. It messes with your head. Best advice: get as far away as you can, and don't look back. Tom ended the conversation and tried to focus on the road, but unease gnawed at him. He felt watched, even with no cars visible in his mirrors. Every shadow on the roadside seemed to shift as he passed, every distant figure blurred just enough to look unnatural. After a few hours, he pulled into a truck stop on the outskirts of a mid-sized city. He needed fuel and time to clear his head. As he stepped out of the cab, he noticed something chilling, a fresh Polaroid tucked into his driver's side mirror. This one showed his truck, parked exactly where it was now, but the time stamp on the bottom corner was from 5 minutes ago. Tom spun around, scanning the area. The lot was busy with other truckers and travelers, but no one seemed to be paying him any attention. He shoved the photo into his pocket and quickly refueled, wanting to get back on the highway as soon as possible. Back on the road, Tom pulled out the first Polaroid, the one of the old woman. He noticed something he hadn't before. In the background, barely visible, was a sign hanging on the wall of her house. It was partially obscured, but he could make out the word registry. His mind raced. Could this be a clue? Was the old woman trying to guide him somewhere? He decided to call a friend, Jake, who ran a small garage and was something of a conspiracy buff. If anyone could help him make sense of this, it was Jake. "Jake," Tom said when his friend picked up. "I've got something weird going on. Can I swing by your place?" "Sure," Jake said. "But what kind of weird are we talking about?" "I'll explain when I get there. Just be ready." A few hours later, Tom pulled into Jake's driveway. The garage was a cluttered mess, as always, but Jake was waiting outside, sipping coffee and looking curious. Tom handed him the Polaroids. "What do you make of these?" Jake studied them, his expression growing more serious by the second. "This is some creepy stuff, man. Where'd you get these?" Tom explained everything: the diner, the old woman, the men in the suit. Jake listened without interrupting, then nodded slowly. "That sign in the background," Jake said, pointing to the Polaroid of the old woman. "It could be referring to the National Registry of Historic Places. Maybe her house is listed there. Could give us a lead." Jake pulled out his laptop and began searching. After a few minutes, he found something. "There's a house registered as historic about 10 miles from where you stopped at that diner," Jake said. "It matches the description. Says it used to be a way station for travelers back in the 1800s. But here's the kicker: it's been abandoned for over 50 years. Tom felt the blood drain from his face. "That's not possible. I talked to her. I was there." Jake shrugged. "Either you're losing it, or you just had a run-in with something. Not normal." Tom sat in silence, staring at the photos. He had two choices: ignore everything, keep driving, and hope the strangeness stopped on its own, or go back to the house and find out the truth. Jake seemed to read his mind. "If you go back, I'm coming with you." "No way you're doing this alone." Tom nodded. "Let's do it." As the two men climbed into Tom's truck and headed toward the house, neither of them noticed the Polaroid now lying on the ground beneath the truck. It showed the two of them in the cab, driving toward the rising sun. And in the back seat, barely visible, was the shadow of a third figure. Tom's truck rumbled down the narrow, cracked road toward the house. He and Jake exchanged uneasy glances but said little. The early morning light bathed the landscape, but it felt as if the day couldn't penetrate the oppressive weight that hung in the air. As they approached, the house came into view, just as Tom remembered it. A single gas pump stood to the side, rusted and silent, and the wooden porch sagged with age. It looked lifeless now, as if no one had been there for years. Tom parked, and the two men stepped out cautiously. Jake held a flashlight, though the daylight made it seem unnecessary. Tom had his phone ready, recording video in case they needed evidence later. The door creaked open at Tom's touch. Inside, the house was just as he remembered: the faint smell of wood smoke, the worn furniture, the kitchen table. But there was no sign of the old woman. Jake scanned the room. "This place gives me the creeps." "Are you sure this is it?" "This is it," Tom replied. His eyes landed on the sign on the wall, the one that had been partially visible in the Polaroid. Up close, it was clear now. It read, "Registry, Travelers Welcome." Tom's voice was steady. This place was meant for people like us. But something changed. Jake motioned toward the kitchen table. "Look at this." A Polaroid camera sat on the table, old and dusty, but still functional. Next to it was a stack of undeveloped film. Jake picked it up, examining it closely. "Why would this be here?" Tom hesitated, then grabbed the camera. Without thinking, he pointed it toward the doorway and snapped a photo. The instant whir of the developing picture filled the silence. When the photo emerged, Tom shook it and waited for the image to appear. When it did, both men recoiled. The photo showed the kitchen, exactly as it was, but the old woman was standing in the doorway. Her face was gaunt and twisted in an expression of sorrow. Behind her, shadowy figures crowded, their outlines human but indistinct. Jake dropped the film he was holding. "We need to get out of here. Now." As they turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own. The sound echoed through the house, and both men froze. Tom reached for the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. "It's locked." Jake pulled out his flashlight and scanned the room. "What the hell is going on?" A low creaking noise came from above, like footsteps on an old wooden floor. Tom and Jake exchanged a look of pure terror. "We're not alone," Jake whispered. Tom's heart raced. He reached for the camera again, snapping another photo toward the ceiling. The photo developed quickly, and when it came into focus, Tom nearly dropped it. The image showed the rafters, and in them were more of the shadowy figures, their faces blank but their forms unmistakably human. Jake grabbed Tom's arm. "We're getting out of here. Forget the door." They moved to a side window, which Jake managed to force open with a few hard shoves. The two of them climbed out, falling into the dirt below. They ran to the truck, not stopping to look back. Tom started the engine, and Jake slammed the door shut. Gravel flew as the truck sped down the road, leaving the house behind. Neither of them spoke until they were miles away, the house no longer visible in the rearview mirror. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "What the hell was that place?" Tom shook his head, his grip tight on the wheel. "I don't know. And I don't care. We're not going back." Jake nodded. "But someone needs to know. What if other people end up there?" Tom glanced at him. "What are we going to tell them? That we found a haunted house with a camera that shows ghosts? No one's going to believe us." Jake fell silent, and they drove on. Days later, Tom returned to his normal routine, but he couldn't shake the events of that night. He still had the Polaroids, tucked away in a drawer, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them. One evening, as he sat in his truck at a rest stop, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. The message read, "You left something behind." Attached was a photo. It showed the house, but this time, the front porch was empty, no gas pump, no sign, just an abandoned structure. Tom stared at the screen, a cold dread creeping over him. He deleted the message and threw the phone onto the passenger seat. Then he started the truck and drove, hoping he could outrun whatever was chasing him.